cares about tripping over that rug. So off to a great start.
It's all downhill now.
Mine's the one with a hemlock, is that right? That's part of the deal. Okay, here's what you need to know, other than the fact that I love you guys immensely, and it's gonna suck to leave. This is from the final chapter of my novel in progress. It's called For the Life of the World to Come, and some of the final scenes are with born-again Christian minister. He's dying of cancer, and he's having a crisis of faith. He's also a Vietnam vet. The nurses outside were laughing about something Karen couldn't catch, complaining about the holiday traffic on the island, and still talking about the coming rain. He pressed his call button and grimaced when he heard one of them, he wasn't sure which one, say, "Oh God, what now?" That one was immediately scolded by another nurse, one whose voice he couldn't place. "Hush up," this one hissed. "Don't you know he's a man of the cloth?" "Well, you handle him then. I'm not in the mood." Initially, upon his arrival in country, Karen had held to the Army's rules of engagement regarding the destruction of civilian property. Once early on, he had struck in the jaw one of his own men who had shot a villager's cow, just for fun. By the end of Karen's first tour, however, he found that he had no qualms about the indiscriminate waste, whether it was the destruction of material goods or property, or the taking of human life. Karen had had little sympathy for those he'd come to fight. He took no pleasure in killing. He saw it simply as a job he'd been hired to do. He drew the line, though, at the mutilation of the dead. He remembered now that once he had failed to sanction a man in his platoon who had, over time, collected in a little bag a number of human ears. Karen no longer could remember why he hadn't punished the man. Had he been afraid of him? Quite possibly it was this, that to punish the man, he remembered now, his name was Mitchell. To punish Mitchell, he would have to first acknowledge that one human could do that to the corpse of another. To acknowledge that much would have been to concede that it was possible to do even worse. Initially, he had not recognized the shriveled pieces of flesh for what they were. Honestly, this was embarrassing for him to recall, that it had ever been this possible for him to be that naive. Karen had thought at first that the man was passing around pieces of dried apples from home. When he finally realized what was happening, he'd been too discomfited to say anything, that this had occurred under his own watch, that Mitchell had been about his habit of his for some time, was more than jarring to Karen. As he lay in his cot that first night, after learning of Mitchell's behavior, he recoiled at the memory of the sight of the wrinkled little discs, some with black hairs still sticking out of them, but he lacked the wherewithal to follow up with an order for Mitchell to dispose of them. He consoled himself for the moment with the thought that Mitchell was sick and that he needed help, but soon that thought offered no comfort. Mitchell was killed a week later on patrol. He was shot in the head by a sniper, hidden at the river's edge, and Karen immediately asked for the man's collection to be burned and for the ashes to be disposed of. He never spoke of Mitchell again to anyone. Karen remembered that most of the indigenous people he had come across in his time there were deeply religious in their private lives. Even the most destitute families had ornate shrines to gods and to the memories of loved ones. A few of his men had also been believers. Some of the younger ones especially, whom he saw regularly reading their Bibles in tents or praying. Karen had held nothing against any of them. His men, he understood, were afraid, and the locals knew they were acting out of thousands of years of tradition. Karen's own conversion, now almost 40 years ago, seemed a distant, hollow memory. The late-night Bible studies, the prayer meetings, with so much talk of the approaching end of times, back then it had all seemed so pressing. He could remember the constant sense of immediacy, of being pressed for time. The end of the world seemed right around the corner. With the loss of their second child still so fresh in their minds, every day seemed like it was the last day on earth. Sitting with Elizabeth in her room at the hospital, holding the still warm body of their dead daughter, he believed then, no, he knew that God had singled him out. He was being punished. The panic was rising again, the thought of the growth inside his own head, invisible, yet still very much there. He pressed the nurse's call button twice more and shifted himself in his bed. He couldn't swallow. His head was pounding. The book lay open across his lap, and he would have sworn he could feel it burning the skin of his thighs, even through his blankets and his sheets. He listened for the nurse's footsteps and studied the window frame before him. From where he was sitting, he could see the latch that held the window shut. If only one of the nurses would come and open it. He pressed the call button again. Karen had killed, indirectly, by his decisions in battle, perhaps hundreds of men. Directly, and with intent, he had killed one man, at least one that he could still remember. He and his platoon were on patrol not far from the Cochin River. They had settled into a small basin covered with thick vegetation. A man named Brown was on point, and Karen had positioned himself where he could see each of the men, and also the ridge that ran all the way from the base of the opposite hill down to a little footbridge that crossed a wide ravine. At the bottom of the ravine lay a small, burbling creek. The little footbridge was a busy thoroughfare through which the Vietnamese infantry passed every day, and the wide open at the juncture of the valley, surrounded on all sides by large ironwoods underneath a blazing sun. The game had been for each patrol to dismantle the bridge and to see how long it would take the Viet Cong to rebuild it. Every time Karen and his men returned, the bridge was there, just as though nothing had happened. The running joke had given them all something to think about and chuckle over, and Karen liked to picture the enemy cursing them when they found their bridge hacked down again or blown to bits, just as they cursed the VC upon finding the bridge reconstituted and whole again. This morning in particular, as they rested in the slope of the basin, hidden from view by the bamboo beside them and the vines above them, Karen watched as an MFA rifleman approached the bridge. The man was little. He probably wouldn't have stood higher than Karen's shoulder. He was alone. His rifle was slung down, upside down across his back, and he was taking his time crossing the bridge. The ironwoods in the valley seemed to glow with the light and the heat of the sun, and the birds nestled in them were singing brightly. The man seemed absent-minded, as though he was on a Sunday stroll, as though he didn't have a care in the world. Soon, Karen realized, as the man's voice reached them, that he too was singing softly. The melody was light and tender, and even though he couldn't understand the words, the song was a pleasant sound in the bright early morning sun. Karen caught a glimpse of Brown out of the corner of his eye, and the man was on the verge of laughter. Karen held up his hand and put his finger to his lips while his men watched. Slowly, he raised his M14, thumbed to safety, and picked the man off. There was a vivid spray of blood in the sunshine, bright red against the glowing green of the ironwoods, like the broad arc of a lace ribbon. The man's body spun around twice before toppling over the rope edging of the little bridge. There was the soft crash of the man's limbs wheeling into the brush, the splash of running water in the creek where his body came to rest, and what followed was a crushing silence. Karen and his men waited. They waited for the repercussions, for the return of fire, for a rush of retaliation, a spray of automatic weapons, but nothing came after. Minutes passed. The sun moved in its paces. Nothing followed but pure silence, broken only by the eventual cry of a distant partridge. Karen remembered the little man singing on the footbridge, and he thought, no, he was certain of it, that the man had thought, just before Karen had held up his hand and raised his rifle, that he was truly immortal, that putting one foot down on the rickety bridge and then another followed by another, and combined together, they would lead him across the wide ravine and the small creek, and that after that, there would still be more to life, there would still be more of the world left to come, that after he had reached the narrow dirt road on the other side, the man would still be alive, and the day after that, and the day after that, and that someday, yes, he would die, as would everyone he had ever known. But just then, and for that day, and for the one to follow, and perhaps the next several thousand still, he was inviolably alive. And this, of all things, was something worth singing about. Karen wanted to throw up. He was choking on the stale air in his room, and he wanted nothing more than to open the window. He tried to rise from his bed again, but when he pushed up from the mattress, his hand slipped off the railing, and he fell back down into his sheets that were fouled with his own sweat. Never in his time in the service had he thought about his own death for more than a few minutes. Even through the worst of his diagnosis, his present condition, which by all concessions was very bad, it had only barely occurred to him that he might die. And since his conversion, it had never once dawned on him that he might not be resurrected, that he would not see his children again, or his grandchildren, or his Elizabeth. Now though, he pressed the call button once more, and this time he held it down hard with his thumb. He closed his eyes and he waited, stemming the panic with a measured effort of his breathing. "I'm coming," he heard a voice say from the nurse's station. "I'm on my way, Reverend." The door to his room swung open on its hinges. The nurse, had he seen her before, he didn't recognize her, or maybe he did. She was breathless when she entered, and there were little beads of sweat across her upper lip. "You can let go now," she said. She took the call button from his hand. "I'm here. I'm here."